What's good? It's your boy Jay with the J Academy, and today we'll be talking about the spinal cord and spinal cord injuries. So let's get started. Now, say you hop in your foreign whip, right? Here, I have my poorly drawn Lamborghini, and in this foreign whip, in the right front end is the headlamp wiring and the AC wiring, right? So let's say you get in a crash because we dumb rich and you mess up the right front end. So what's gonna mess up and not work in your Lambo? Well, your headlamp and your AC aren't gonna work. So similarly, the brain and the nervous system is just a bunch of wiring. So here we have the brain, here's the left and the right side, as denoted by the L and the R. But we don't really take the L though, if you know what I'm saying. All right, and here's the brain stem. Here's the spinal segment, which is the segment of the spine. And today we'll be talking about three types of wiring: the motor, the anterolateral, also known as the spinothalamic, and the posterior, also known as the dorsal. So the motor is responsible for movement and the contraction of muscles. The anterolateral, also known as the spinothalamic, is responsible for pain and temperature sensation. Now the antero is kind of like anterior, right? So it's in the anterior or the front of the spinal cord. So if you're looking at the top through the transverse plane like this, then it'll be located towards the front. Now the posterior is in the back, because that's what posterior means, right? And it's also known as the dorsal. That's responsible for the touch sensation, vibration sensation, and proprioception, which is the feeling of position, right? All right, so let's go look at the wiring over here. Let's start with the motor, which is the black line. And so it comes from the brain. It can come from either side, but let's just say it comes from the right. And it goes down from the cerebral cortex and down into the brainstem, and then it crosses over, right? So it goes contralateral. That's what it means. Contralateral means to go to the other side. Ipsilateral is to go on the same side. So it goes ipsilateral from here to here, and then it goes contralateral when it crosses over, right? And then it goes down the spinal cord onto the spinal segment, where it synapses onto another motor neuron, and this motor neuron will contract the muscle. So the motor neuron that contracts the muscle is called the lower motor neuron, and the neuron that carries the message from the brain to the spinal segment is called the upper motor neuron. Right, so now let's look at the anterolateral, which is in red right over here. And so remember that this is a sensory neuron, so we're going to start from the bottom. So it senses something, right? So then it goes from its receptor to the spinal segment, and it immediately goes contralateral. So this is coming from the left side and immediately switches over to the right side of the spinal column, and then it goes right back up on the opposite side. So that's an important difference. And then the posterior and the dorsal is like the motor neuron. So right over here in the blue, you get the sensation, and then it stays ipsilateral all the way until the brainstem. Then it crosses over up into the brain, right? And so this is important to know, because let's say you just crashed your Lambo, and now, well, you damaged the whole right side of your spinal cord, right? So if you damage the whole right side, which is over here, then what would you lose? Well, you would lose the things in red, which is the anterolateral. So now you can't sense pain or temperature, but since you only lost the right, the left still works. So you would still have the motor function, and you'd also have the touch, vibration, and proprioception. Now, let's say you lose the left side of your spinal cord, right? So you lose the blue, and you also lose the black. And so then you'd lose the motor, and you'd also lose the touch, vibration, and proprioception. Now, if let's say you get in a really bad accident in your Lambo, because, you know, like The Weeknd said, 100 on the dash, get you close to God, right? And then you cut the whole thing, because, you know, you just cut the whole spinal column in your accident right over here. So then obviously you lose your motor, your anterolateral, and your posterior, so you'd lose all the functions, which kind of suck. Now, what specific functions you would lose really depends on where you cut the spinal cord, which I shall demonstrate with this lovely illustration. So here's the brain, right over here, and then here's the spinal column. And so when you cut, you lose all the functions that's below it, right? So let's say you cut right over here. Well, then you lose all the functions below it, right? So let's start with the cervical. So the cervical is the first part of the spinal cord from the top. There's 4 parts, and that's responsible for breathing, head and neck movement, and wrist and elbow movement. So if you were to cut it right here, well, then you die because you can't breathe and you can't move your head and your neck, and then you lose everything else below that too, right? So then the second part is the thoracic. That's responsible for your hands, controlling your abs, and also ejaculation. And so if you cut it right there, then you lose that, which also kind of sucks. And then the third part is the lumbar. So then if you get cut right there, you lose your hips, your quads, and your hamstrings. And then the fourth part is the sacral. So if you get cut right there, then you can't get an erection, and you would also not have any control over your bowel movements or your bladder. Right, so now that concludes introduction to spinal cord injuries. Stay tuned for the next video.